What was Camus' true intention in writing The Stranger? Is Camus himself the model for Meursault? What would Camus say if this book became a defense of nihilism crime? As The Stranger has gained widespread circulation, many people have misinterpreted it, and it even led to real-life crimes. In this video, we'll dive into the true meaning of The Stranger and uncover the untold stories behind Camus' creation and life. Then we'll reveal the authentic philosophy of absurdism upheld by Camus in conjunction with Caligula and the myth of Sisyphus. Get ready, let's step into the absurd world together. In 1942, The Stranger was finally published during World War II, despite the pressures of blockade controls and paper shortages, immediately sparking significant controversy. On one hand, admirers of this book unanimously hailed it as the finest work of fiction in recent years. Sartre, already renowned in intellectual circles, penned an extensive review expressing his admiration. He also expounded on his interpretation of the book's philosophical essence. The absurd man establishes itself in revolt. And Meursault is an example of this virile silence, this refusal to mince words. What Sartre read in the book was not nihilism, but revolt. On the other hand, the book also faced some fierce criticism. The harshest attacks came from André Rousseau, a conservative Catholic critic. His review of The Stranger was full of harsh moral criticism. Rousseau considered Meursault an inhuman character, finding his indifference despicable. He acknowledged Camus' writing talent, describing his sentences as precise and concise, but argued that this very talent made Meursault's inhumanity all the more repulsive. As a devout Catholic, Rousseau explicitly stated he would ignore the dialogue between Meursault and the priest in the novel because he could not accept Meursault's atheistic beliefs. But Rousseau's commentary contained misquotes. The original text stated, "My nature often makes my physiological factors hinder my feelings," while Rousseau criticized this poor fellow, claiming he has never mastered his natural feelings, which completely negated the sense of helpless, innate constraint that Camus wanted to express. His commentary made Camus feel unfairly treated. Camus believed Rousseau misunderstood his work and attempted to judge art by his own moral standards. But these comments reflect the fact from the side that when people read a literary work, they will be more easily influenced by the direct storyline and the performance of the characters, while neglecting to dissect the depth of connotation that the author wants to express. Many readers even attach fictional plots and characters to themselves and are deeply affected by fictional characters and ideas. Some works have relatively mild and subtle plots, and such ideas are harmless. But the storyline of The Stranger is too cold and sharp. Finally, a shocking murder catapulted Camus and his work into the limelight. In 1948 France, the gloom of World War II has not yet fully lifted, and a group of young men who lost a normal childhood in the war are trying to find their way through the chaos. The name J3 comes from the category of wartime vouchers, which stood for vouchers providing extra food for the 16 to 20 age group. It was later used to represent the generation whose childhood was sacrificed to the war. Among them, a high school student named Claude Panconi, at the urging of two friends, brutally murdered his classmate, Alain Guyarder. The case was quickly sensationalized by the media as a bizarre story about a love triangle and class struggle. The most shocking part was the reasons the murderer gave for defending himself during the interrogation. Panconi claimed to the judge that his criminal inspiration came from Meursault's murder in The Stranger. He declared, "Meursault made me do it." Panconi firmly believed that if judges could not understand that Meursault killed without hatred, they could not truly understand his actions. He attempted to wrap his crime in a literary interpretation, challenging the traditional logic of the judiciary. During the lengthy trial preparation phase, the victim's father, Raoul Guyarder, wrote to Camus, pleading with the author of The Stranger to publicly condemn Panconi's literary defense. He argued that if Camus denied any influence of his work on the murderer, Panconi would have to bear full responsibility for his actions. He feared that Panconi's literary defense would work, and justice would never be served for his son's tragic death. However, Camus found himself in a dilemma. He knew that no novel, whether it was Mariaque's story of a woman poisoning her husband or Oedipus's patricide, would directly encourage people to commit crimes. But as a writer, he couldn't be entirely certain that his work hadn't indirectly influenced Panconi. He understood the power of language and the responsibility a writer bears for their words. He couldn't easily distance himself from the issue to protect his reputation. Camus ultimately refused Mr. Guader's request. He wrote a private letter to Mr. Guader, which was later leaked to the media and reprinted in newspapers. In the letter, Camus expressed his complex emotions and profound thoughts. If I vehemently deny that The Stranger incites crime, then this book, like all my other books, in its own way demonstrates my aversion to the death penalty and my painful questioning of any suspected guilty verdict. My work, sir, and this time I say it with sorrow, is not intended to accuse others. It is intended to understand them, to speak out for their shared misfortunes. That is why, however I may feel, I cannot side with the accusers, even if it would preserve my reputation as a writer. Camus believed he couldn't easily accuse the murderer of being a completely independent individual, just to absolve himself of suspicion of influencing the killer. In a trial that could lead to severe punishment, he couldn't risk serving the prosecution. He chose to bear the potential harm of his words and also the responsibility of understanding human nature. For him, Meursault wasn't simply a murderer, but a character who refused to lie even to the point of death, representing a rejection of social hypocrisy and conventional emotions. The Stranger's repeated misinterpretations, even leading to real-life tragedies, made Camus more cautious in reflecting on and examining his language. He once stated that he wasn't sure if he wanted The Stranger to reach a general readership. Perhaps it should remain only among readers of philosophy magazines. He even wrote self-deprecatingly when signing autographs for friends. If you don't want to be sentenced to death, be sure to cry at your mother's funeral. What an ironic statement. Yet, it also reveals how we should approach the fiction of literary works and our own real lives. Although Sartre's commentary and Camus' interpretation suggest that Meursault are not simply cold-blooded killers, many readers do indeed perceive absolute nihilism and negativity, and are even deeply influenced by them. How was such a contradictory and tense character created? What exactly did Camus want to express? In Paris, just emerging from the shadow of war, a long-lost sense of freedom filled the air. That day, in an old apartment building, Camus and his wife invited friends to celebrate the new year. Sartre and Beauvoir were also present. Inside, people laughed, smoked, and debated philosophy, celebrating the beginning of a new world. But among these intellectually vibrant souls, one man remained silent all evening. Camus noticed him and whispered to Sartre and Beauvoir, "Do you see that man? He is the model for The Stranger, Pierre Galindo." Galindo was a friend Camus had made in Algeria. He was a burly man, dark-skinned, and seemingly perpetually unshaven. He was taciturn, sometimes remaining silent for 15 minutes at a time. He was exceptionally intelligent, yet his manners were coarse, lacking in refinement and social etiquette. Camus and Galindo were very close friends, often spending time together. Camus once described Galindo as one of the friends who gave him a complete sense of friendship, and the only person in Oran he was willing to live with. Camus was very curious about Galindo from the beginning, and through long-term observation and contact, he gained a deep understanding of Galindo's personality, behavior, and experiences. The murder scene on the beach in The Stranger was based on Galindo's real-life experience. One day, Galindo and his wife went to the beach with another couple friends. They had rented a villa on beach. The Galindos stayed at the villa to rest, while the other couple went for a walk on the beach. On the beach, they encountered two Arab men. One of the Arab men approached the wife, and the husband argued with him, which escalated into a physical fight. During the fight, the husband was stabbed in the mouth. He returned to the villa, called Galindo, and grabbed a revolver, intending to take revenge on the Arab man. But the Arab man escaped. The police later that afternoon arrested the two Arab men. In this true story, no one fired a shot. Camus later heard about it incorporated it into his novel The Stranger, and rewrote the ending, having Galindo in his book shoot and kill the Arab man. Why did Camus design it this way? Based on his understanding of Galindo, did he believe that a shooting was entirely possible if the Arab man hadn't escaped? Camus' diary also records this story about Galindo. One day, Galindo was sitting by the window on the second floor of a house when he saw a group of cats on the street outside. So he threw shredded paper out the window to attract the cats' attention, and then, after waiting for the cats to get closer, he aimed and spat at them. Once he hit one, he would burst into uncontrollable laughter. Does this story make Galindo seem a bit strange? Let's look back at some other similar incomprehensible details of Meursault in book. First, Meursault appears extremely unfamiliar and bewildered by the rules of society. Meursault's understanding of interpersonal relationships is simple and direct. He would treat Raymond as a good brother and help him write letters simply because Raymond was friendly to him. When imprisoned in a cell full of Arab prisoners and asked what crime he had committed, he only answered, "I killed an Arab," completely unaware of the inappropriateness and danger of this answer. He could not understand the connection between his attitude at his mother's funeral and the crime he had committed at this moment, as the lawyer said. He would only sincerely express his most genuine feelings. He could not understand the fact that smoking was not allowed in prison, and only after the prison guard's explanation did he understand that the meaning of prison was to restrict personal freedom. Attention deficiency. His focus was often unusual. In his mother's morgue, he was distracted by the behavior and appearance of the other people in the room. He could sit by the window watching all sorts of people outside all day. While eating in the dining room, he would observe a woman's movements with extreme detail, even unconsciously following her after she finished eating and left, while forgot about her completely in the blink of an eye. When Mary came to visit him in prison, his attention jumped around to other prisoners and their relatives. Abnormal response to external stimuli. In the story of the beach murder, he tried to avoid the sun by moving forward, unaware that this would be interpreted as provocation by his initially passive opponent. He exhibited panicked and disoriented behavior in response to external stimuli. The Arab's brandished knife, the scorching sun, and the sweat covering his eyes drove him forward, ultimately pulling the trigger. When the judge asked him his motive, he sincerely said it was because of the sun, only to be met with laughter from the crowd, while he simply looked at them with utter bewilderment and helplessness. Social deficiency, attention deficiency, and abnormal response to external stimuli, these symptoms, when appearing individually, are insufficient to explain the problem, but when combined, they closely resemble a mental illness, Asperger syndrome, the most functionally advanced form of autism spectrum disorder. People with Asperger's have different ways of processing information and perceiving the world, leading to some behaviors that differ from those of ordinary people, but their IQ is the same as, or even higher than, that of ordinary people. Meursault's speech, thoughts, actions, and behaviors all exhibit a consistent and repetitive pattern. He has poor social and interpersonal communication skills, finds it difficult to express himself, understand the thoughts of others, or perceive subtle differences in nonverbal cues. He often experiences sudden emotional fluctuations due to specific environmental stimuli, which can trigger aggressive behavior. In autism forums, many readers who also have autism had strong feelings and doubts while reading The Stranger, convinced that Meursault's behavior likely indicated he had autism. However, ordinary readers who cannot empathize with him might easily overlook this possibility when reading the novel. Considering others' opinions of Galindo's own eccentric behavior, Camus' precise portrayal of Meursault, and the keen perception of autistic readers, we are convinced that Meursault suffers from autism. Viewing Meursault from this perspective, many previously perplexing points suddenly become clear. Yet, was Camus' work simply an attempt to document the absurd behavior and story of an autistic friend? Camus' novel The Stranger was published in 1942. While the earliest academic description of Asperger's syndrome was proposed by the Austrian doctor Asperger in 1943, and it received little attention from the medical community for decades afterward. Today, with a more comprehensive understanding, we would naturally treat this special group of people with different emotions and in different ways. However, at that time, there was a significant gap in medical knowledge, and people simply viewed autistic individuals as another form of eccentricity. The misunderstandings and violence stemming from human ignorance and self-righteousness are a manifestation of the absurdity of the world. But Camus' initial intention was definitely not merely to write an observational journal of autism. He simply borrowed his friend's unusual behavior and literary exaggeration to express a phenomenon and feeling with greater tension. If medical understanding had been available at the time, Camus might not have used a patient as a prototype, as this would have affected the universality and impact of his work. Furthermore, Camus' perception of the absurd world was far more complex than that. Looking back at Meursault's words and actions, some cannot be entirely explained by autism. For example, his discourse on marriage and love, his attitude towards his boss, and his final outburst and psychological state in prison. Meursault did not maintain consistency at all times. At other times, he seemed to exhibit another personality. This personality's absolute indifference stemmed from absolute rationality, drawing conclusions from experience and reasoning that nothing was meaningful, giving a stark sense of alienation and nihilism. Yet, he resolutely refused to conform, refused to lie to himself in the world, and maintained the purest of emotions. This creates a contradictory feeling. Nihilism and rebellion seem to coexist within him. Camus publicly stated in his notes and interviews that 3 people were the models for the stranger, including 2 men and 1 woman. One of the men was Pierre Galindo, and the other man was himself. Meursault's other personality is an alter ego of Camus himself. Throughout Camus' works, public statements, and letters, he consistently displays caution, strength, and optimism. But how could such a natural and profound sense of nihilism be portrayed so vividly by such a man, resonating with so many? This seemingly contradictory aspect often conceals the deepest secret. Albert Camus was born on the 7th of November, 1913, in Mondovi, Algeria. A few months later, World War I broke out, and Camus' father was drafted into the French army and sent to the European front. Camus' mother, who was hearing impaired, was unable to support the family alone, so she took her 2 sons back to Algiers to live with her mother. In the autumn of 1914, shortly after enlisting, Camus' father was shot in the head during the Battle of the Marne and died from his wounds. Camus lost his father when he was less than a year old. From then until he was 17, Camus lived in extreme poverty in a small, dark house in a poor area of Algiers, with his grandmother, mother, uncle, and brother. Camus' grandmother was illiterate and had never attended school, yet she was the true pillar of the family. The harshness of poverty had hardened her like a stone, cold and unyielding, devoid of any warmth. Perhaps this was why she could so tenaciously support the entire family. She was extremely strict, even brutal and domineering, with her children. She raised 9 children in this way and became Camus' most frequently interacted guardian during his childhood. Camus experienced unquestionable dominance from his grandmother. Mistakes were met with beatings, and when he wasn't in school, he had to work. His grandmother instilled in Camus the meaning and personal experience of concepts like shame, morality, dignity, and authority. As for Camus' mother, the most profound impression she left on the young Camus was this image. In the dim light of evening, she would sit by the window in a chair, gazing out, remaining motionless for a long time. Camus would silently watch his mother from the doorway, and she would never notice her son's presence. She was imprisoned in a world of semi-deafness, quiet and silent, polite and even passive throughout her life, giving an impression that was both beautiful and unapproachable. Her gentle face was always serene, and her beautiful eyes always held a timid, submissive, and distant gaze. When her grandmother whipped Camus, his mother would watch with this same gaze, but without interfering. She herself never touched him, nor even truly cursed her children. This whipping was undoubtedly torture for her as well, enduring the whips that lashed her children over the long years, just as she endured the hardships of serving others. Without men, without comfort, spending her days amidst greasy leftovers and other people's dirty clothes, enduring day after day of suffering, she eventually became numb and stubborn. But young Camus couldn't understand all of this at the time. His mother's silence and forbearance made it difficult for Camus to be sure whether he had his mother's love for a long time. In such a family environment, Camus lived a poor but peaceful life until a serious illness at the age of 17 changed his life forever. One day during his high school years, Camus suddenly began coughing severely and coughing up blood. After seeking medical attention, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Throughout human history, tuberculosis has been considered an incurable disease, a deadly and contagious illness that requires lifelong care. Even slight fatigue or malnutrition can worsen the condition and even lead to death. It wasn't until 1943 that the first effective antibiotic was discovered. But for Camus in 1930, this disease was generally considered a death sentence in poor neighborhoods. This sudden and lifelong illness severely disrupted his peaceful life and made Camus truly begin to examine life and experience its absurdity. Afterward, he was forced to stop attending school to receive treatment because his family could not afford the cost of hospitalization in a sanatorium, and he had to be cared for by his family. This illness left permanent damage to his lungs. For the rest of Camus' life, tuberculosis constantly plagued him, offering only slight relief and never a full recovery. Several severe relapses forced him to interrupt his work and recuperate. Because of the disease, Camus lost the right to run and shout in the sunshine, the opportunity to join the army, and the qualification to become a teacher, a dream he had had since childhood. Before his illness, Camus was very outgoing and energetic, often spending time with friends, sunshine, and the sea. But after his illness, his classmates saw him as melancholic and sentimental, exhibiting more indifference, harshness, and alienation. In 1933, with his condition improving, Camus enrolled at the University of Algiers to study philosophy. There he met his first wife, Simone Hiet. Simone was elegant and mysterious, with a touch of vulgarity. Her eyelids were painted pale, purple, and blue. She wore false eyelashes, and she dressed in see-through clothing. She had many boyfriends, and people described her as cynical. She called herself a love scammer. In addition, she was a drug addict, recklessly abusing morphine, which had initially helped her relieve pain. But Camus fell madly in love with her and married Simone despite his family's objections. After their marriage, Simone often suffered from drug abuse, frequently experiencing mental instability and erratic behavior. Camus continued to try to help his wife quit, but to no avail. In the summer of 1936, Camus, his wife Simone, and a male friend traveled to Central Europe. During the trip, Camus suffered a relapse of tuberculosis and could no longer travel by kayak. Simone then left with the male friend, leaving Camus alone. During this trip, Camus stumbled upon a secret letter from Simone's doctor, in which he discovered that Simone and the doctor had been having an affair, and that he was the one who provided the drugs. This was a devastating blow to Camus, who then spent several days in Prague in a state of utter stagnation, struggling with a foolish depression. Upon returning to Algiers, Camus finally resolved to divorce Simone. Camus' first marriage ended in chaos and pain, becoming one of the most painful blows of his life. In the book, Meursault says that physiological reasons often affect my emotional expression, because Camus suffered from tuberculosis and lost some of the basic rights of a healthy person. Meursault's attitude towards love and marriage stems from Camus' painful marital experience, and his final self-debate on death comes from his premature reflection on an incurable disease. Born into extreme poverty, with his father martyred, growing up in shame and repression, suffering a serious illness at a young age, and his wife's infidelity leading to the breakdown of their marriage, these devastating blows fell upon Camus, one after another, forcing him to experience the indifference of the world at an early age. Melancholy thus became the underlying tone of his life, and that straightforward sadness and indifference appear between the lines of Meursault's writing. Camus did not shy away from expressing these emotions because he knew it was an inevitable path to examining the absurdity of the world. But nihilism and indifference are merely the starting point for understanding Meursault and Camus, certainly not Camus' answer to the world. In 1955, Camus revealed the true substance of the book in the preface to the American edition of The Stranger. Camus wrote this: "He, hero of my book, is condemned because he does not play the game. In this respect, he is foreign to the society in which he lives. He wanders on the fringe, in the suburbs of private, solitary, sensual life. And this is why some readers have been tempted to look upon him as a piece of social wreckage. A much more accurate idea of the character, or at least one much closer to the author's intentions, will emerge if one asks just how Meursault doesn't play the game. The reply is a simple one. He refuses to lie. To lie is not only to say what isn't true, it is also, and above all, to say more than is true. And, as far as the human heart is concerned, to express more than one feels. He says what he is, he refuses to hide his feelings, and immediately, society feels threatened. For me, therefore, Meursault is not a piece of social wreckage, but a poor and naked man enamored of a sun that leaves no shadows. Far from being bereft of all feeling, he is animated by a passion that is deep because it is stubborn. A passion for the absolute and for truth. This truth is still a negative one, the truth of what we are and what we feel, but without it, no conquest of ourselves or of the world will ever be possible. One would therefore not be much mistaken to read The Stranger as a story of a man who, without any heroics, agrees to die for the truth." This preface points the way to further understanding of Meursault and Camus. In this social game, conformity is always the easiest and safest choice. People readily accept the subtle erosion of society, acting according to so-called common sense without reflecting on the essence of things, feigning indifference, muddling through, deceiving themselves, and gloating. Under the pervasive infiltration of social rules, having independent thought and judgment means facing ubiquitous resistance from the entire society. Like Meursault in prison, his lawyer demands he tell lies he doesn't want to, and the investigating judge forces him to bow to his religious beliefs. Your adherence to your principles and refusal to obey challenges their understanding, negates their lives, and makes them feel nakedly threatened. This inevitably leaves you alone to suffer the backlash of the secular tide. In such a secular world, Meursault's refusal to lie is not an indifferent act of punishment. On the contrary, in the face of trial, it is an act of resistance, requiring immense courage because the price is a death sentence. Undoubtedly, Camus himself, behind Meursault, practiced this spirit of resistance and upheld his principles throughout his life. Even though this would cause his fate to be repeatedly fraught with hardship, Camus refused to succumb to the suffering imposed upon him by fate. The successive blows only fueled his will to resist and helped him establish his worldview at an earlier age. In the 1930s, Algeria was plagued by extreme social inequality. Under the colonial system, French colonists held privileges, while native Algerian Arabs were deeply oppressed. Albert Camus was acutely sensitive to social injustice, always concerned for the underprivileged, and actively championed the rights of the indigenous population. Attracted by the anti-colonial, equality, and justice ideals championed by the Communist Party, Camus joined the French Communist Party in 1935. Within the party, he primarily participated in anti-fascist and anti-colonial cultural activities, serving as an organizer and playwright in a theater troupe. Through his work within the party, he gradually discovered certain ideological conflicts. Camus believed that human dignity should not be instrumentalized in politics and that Algerians should have greater autonomy. However, some of the party's lines contradicted his principles and original intentions. Instead of resigning to avoid conflict, he publicly voiced his opposition, and under immense pressure, he refused to compromise, continuing his resistance until his expulsion. After a period of unemployment, Camus got a job as a journalist for Alger Republican. As a reporter and editor, Camus dedicated himself to exposing social injustices in Algeria. His newspaper was later repeatedly censored and shut down by the government due to its anti-war and critical stance. Despite the pressure, he persisted in reporting the truth, refusing to succumb to official propaganda and censorship. As a journalist, Camus had the opportunity to observe trials in court, which allowed him to keenly observe the judicial system's disregard for the vulnerable and how easily their fate, even life or death, could be wrongly decided in what appeared to be a fair court. Camus then used journalism as a weapon to combat the injustices of the judicial system and to give voice to the victims. The most typical example of this was the case of Michel Hodent. Michel, an agricultural technician, was persecuted by the authorities for his sympathy for Algerian farmers and his attempt to help them organize a union. In court, Hodent was accused of embezzling public funds. But Camus' investigation revealed that these accusations were based on unreliable testimony and the prejudice of the colonial government. Camus published a series of articles in Alger Republican, exposing the judicial injustice in this case. He detailed the absurdities of the trial process, such as the judge's bias against Hodent, disregard for evidence, and distrust of native witnesses. Camus' reporting garnered widespread public attention, putting pressure on the judiciary and ultimately leading to Hodent's exoneration. Camus' close contact with the court over the years shocked him with the absurdity of the trial, which he eventually incorporated into the most climax of the stranger's story. Nihilism and Revolt, seemingly contradictory yet coexisting in Meursault, mirror this dualistic unity throughout Camus' life. Born in Algeria, but a French citizen, this dual identity allowed him to sympathize with the suffering of the locals, while simultaneously unable to condone the violence of the later Algerian liberation movement. The poverty of his family and the abundance of the Mediterranean sun and sea intertwined, forming a dual undertone to his perception of the world. The alternating tension between his fragile body and vigorous vitality allowed him to create literary tension amidst pain and ecstasy. He rejected any form of taking sides or labeling, refusing to call himself a philosopher and consistently emphasizing that he did not belong to the existentialism defined by them. In his writing, he consistently valued sensory experience over rational construction, whether in rhetoric, writing style, intellectual content, or emotional expression. A certain ambiguity can be found. The characters he created, like himself, possessed contradictory and complex personalities, defying simple categorization. However, it is precisely this ambiguity that preserves the complex connotations inherent in the subject matter, endowing his works with rich tension and revealing a genuine depth. The charm of Camus' works is rooted in this. The world he depicts is both bright and desolate, and the characters he portrays are both nihilistic and rebellious. Camus' lifelong effort was precisely to encourage humanity to choose resistance amidst insurmountable obstacles, and to allow life to seek value amidst absurdity. Rereading his works with this understanding of Camus will reveal many previously unnoticed details, leading to a deeper understanding of him and his characters. Camus structured his works into several distinct phases, the first being the absurd trilogy. Besides the novel The Stranger, this trilogy includes the play Caligula and the philosophical essay The Myth of Sisyphus, comprehensively expounding his philosophy of the absurd. First, what is absurdity? In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus defines it as, absurdity is neither a property of the world nor of man, but rather the conflict that arises when humanity's pursuit of meaning encounters the world's silence. It is the feeling that arises when your expectations and the world's response are vastly different. For example, Meursault, believing himself to be honest and truthful, is sentenced to death. Humans naturally crave meaning and order, yet the world never heeds any call, coldly disregarding all beings. In this absurd world, trust can be exchanged for deception, foolishness can defeat wisdom, and error can convince the right. Just when you think you can at least control your own life, the various encounters of the world leave you feeling as fragile and powerless as a drifting duckweed. You begin to vaguely see the truth of the world: ruthlessness, chance, randomness, hypocrisy, absurdity, and then you finally ask that question: what is the meaning of human existence? Given the premise that the world is absurd, humanity has only two choices: obedience or revolt. Camus offered his answer in the Absurd Trilogy. The Stranger uses the novel form to depict the absurd experiences of a person, allowing readers to directly feel the absurdity and thus reflect upon it. Caligula tells the story of a king who, deeply traumatized, becomes convinced of the world's absurdity but chooses to submit to it, using his power to push it to extremes, committing various acts of debauchery, and ultimately dying tragically at the hands of revolutionaries. Camus uses this story to extrapolate the choice of submitting to absurdity to an extreme, concluding that if one chooses to submit to absurdity, the end result will inevitably be self-destruction. In the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus first discusses the undesirability of physical suicide, because it is a surrender to absurdity. Choosing to escape absurdity through self-destruction does not solve the problem, but only denies human dignity. Camus also rejects the traditional existentialist choice of a leap in faith, that is, placing hope in some metaphysical belief, which he considers philosophical suicide, an act of abandoning human self-awareness and wisdom. All the rationality of obedience to absurdity is thus completely denied. Therefore, there is only one choice one should make in the face of absurdity, and that is revolt. In the sober awareness of absurdity, one should always resist, knowing that life is meaningless, but still living, loving, and creating, feeling the satisfaction of self-recognition in the midst of resistance, and experiencing the tragic beauty of resistance itself in the midst of suffering, which can be the only meaning of resisting absurdity. At the end of the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus quotes the Greek myth of Sisyphus, in which he is punished eternally by the gods, and in a mountain in the underworld, he must push a huge stone up a steep hill. But every time the stone gets close to the top, it rolls down, and he must push it up the mountain again and again. Camus makes us have to imagine that Sisyphus is happy. Imagine that he smiles as he watches the rock roll back down to the bottom of the hill and walks happily down the hill, ready to begin his next futile effort. Because Sisyphus chooses to look soberly at what has happened to him, his defiance turns the punishment of the gods into his own choice. And with a single thought, he is no longer a slave, but the master of his destiny. However, does this explanation convince you? The fact is that Camus doesn't tell us the full story of Sisyphus. Maybe he's deliberate, but after learning about the real Sisyphus, maybe you'll find a reason to revolt. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was the king of Corinth. He was cunning and treacherous, renowned for his wisdom and intrigue, but his arrogance and disrespect for the gods brought him misfortune. Once, Zeus, king of the gods, kidnapped Aegina, the daughter of the river god, and took her to an island. Sisyphus witnessed this. The river god searched everywhere for his daughter. In exchange for water from the river god for his kingdom, Sisyphus told him the truth. This revelation angered Zeus, who sent Thanatos to capture Sisyphus. However, Sisyphus cleverly tricked Thanatos into demonstrating how to use chains, then quickly bound Thanatos and escaped. Zeus then sent Ares to release Thanatos and take Sisyphus to the underworld. But Sisyphus had already made a backup plan. Upon arriving in the underworld, Sisyphus complained to Hades, saying that his wife's negligence had disturbed his soul. He pleaded to return to Earth for 3 days to make his final arrangements. The queen of the underworld granted his request. Upon returning to Earth, Sisyphus refused to return to the underworld, thus escaping death for the second time. This time, the gods were utterly enraged. They sentenced him to an eternal punishment to push a giant boulder from the foot of a mountain to its summit. But just before reaching the top, the boulder would roll back down, an endless cycle. Sisyphus never easily gave up on any possibility of survival. Behind his cunning lay unyielding spirit and tenacity. He was insignificant yet unafraid to challenge the gods. He was selfish, yet relentlessly sought to save himself. He firmly believed that things would always turn around, that the only constant was change, and that there was no absolute failure. He maintained hope in adversity, refusing to be deterred by his current circumstances, and remained vigilant and prepared for unforeseen circumstances and prosperity. He didn't know if he could push the boulder over the mountaintop next time, so he tried again and again, gazing at the vibrant colors at the summit, the flowers and trees on the mountainside, the bustling life at the foot of the mountain, and then at the boulder rolling down again. Who could know if the next trick would work? I can imagine that such a person might truly be happy. I'm Terry, revealing one truth after another. See you in the next video.